Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. The topic we are going to deal with today is module number 16 of the paper Introduction to Linguistics. The module is titled Morphosyntax I. To give you an outline of what we are going to deal with today, I'll be starting off with morphology syntax interface, derivational morphology and how it induces selectional regularities, derivational morphology and how it changes valency. For this, we'll see valency increasing rules and valency decreasing rules. We'll also be looking at morphosyntax and the rules that appear to change grammatical functions, UTA or the uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis, and ending it with a discussion on causatives in the language Chichewa. Chomsky 1965 stated that the active and the passive verbs are transformationally related, and this transformational relation is based on the selectional regularities that we can see between these two alternating forms. By this I mean to say that the object selected by the active verb is what becomes the subject of the same class of passive verbs. See the data set given to you on your screen. Sentence 1. Sincerity frightens John, and its passive. Sentence 2. John is frightened by sincerity. We see that frightened selects John as one of its argument, which can then become not an object but a subject in its passive form. Compare this with sentences 3 and 4. John frightens sincerity. Sincerity is frightened by John. Frighten as a verb does not select sincerity as its object in the active form, and hence it cannot take it as a subject in the passive form. Thus, what's more economical for grammar is that the grammar states selectional restrictions just once, and that is for the active, and we derive passive by movement of object into the subject position. The same argument of selectional restrictions can also be applied to sentences whose predicates are related by derivational morphology. To see this, look at sentences 5 and 6. Sentence 5, John reads a book. Sentence 6, this book is readable. Reads changes to readable by adding the derivational affix able to it, and thus there is a relation between these two predicates. Compare this with the sentences 7 and 8. John reads courage and courage is readable. Because courage cannot be selected by read as its object, courage cannot be taken as a subject by the adjectival predicate readable. Chomsky 1970 argued that it is not theoretically sound to relate the verbs and adjectives in 5 to 6 transformationally. He said that these transformations needed to have insertion of particular morphemes. Idiosyncratic rules were needed for such transformations, and these rules were dependent on the behavior of particular words that we were dealing with. Post-aspects era, that is the 1970s and the 1980s, we saw word formation rules coming up, and these word formation rules were the ones that were postulated to express such regularities in selectional restrictions. Now there were rules that related the verb read to the adjective readable, and this rule added the suffix morpheme able to the verb root read. This rule also stated a relationship between the class of objects of the verb and the class of subjects of this predicate be readable. The object of the verb read was what was going to become subject of the predicate being readable. The result of all this was that we had lexical word formation rules coming into our theory now. This proliferated the lexicon we had established at that point. The problem was that this was not sufficiently theoretically constrained as such to give us any universal claims about the language so far. Syntactic component was also being explored at this time, and we got general principles of language from the syntactic part of the grammar. As opposed to derivational morphology, inflectional morphology like case marking and agreement also came up, And it was observed that inflectional morphology had to be done syntactically. By this I mean that they were to be done after noun phrases had moved to their designated position, let's say to get case. These factors and various other things gave birth to the field of morphosyntax. Let's now begin from here. How does derivational morphology change valency? To see this, let's see first an example of a valency reducing rule. A common thread between the rule that passivizes a verb and a rule that adds the able suffix to a verb is that both these rules are detransitivizing rules. A transitive verb has two arguments, a subject and an object. An intransitive verb has only one argument, namely the subject. In the passive, object of the active verb appears in the subject position of the passive verb, and the old subject is either elided or expressed by a biphrase. An adjective ending in able, the object of the corresponding transitive verb appears as the subject of the adjectival predicate, and the subject of the transitive verb disappears in this construction. Oldest grammar had described valency as the ability of a verb to take arguments. Thus, a transitive verb had valency 2, an intransitive verb had valency 1. Passive and the able suffixation rule, these were the ones which reduced valency of the verb from 2 to 1. Thus, they are the valency changing rules that operate on the argument structure of a verb. Now, these were valency reducing rules. Let us see a valency increasing rule. By this I mean the rule of causativization. In causativization, there is an addition of an agent that causes the action of the predicate. For example, see the sentences 9 and 10. The bottle broke, John broke the bottle. In the intransitive verb, valency of the verb broke was 1. But in the transitive verb, the valency increases to 2. Here we have addition of John as an argument that is the causer of the event of breaking the bottle. Thus, causativizing this verb has increased the valency of the verb by adding an argument in its argument structure. There is a selectional regularity in 9 and 10 as well. Subject of the intransitive verb appears as the object of the transitive verb. English as a language has a limited set of verbs that undergo this transitive-intransitive alternation. These verbs include verbs like break, move, change, open, drop, and perhaps grow. All these verbs talk about a change of state, and they are given a label, that is inchoative verbs. English has no morphological causative. The form of the verb does not change, and there is no morphological affix that has the transitive or the causativizing meaning in it. However, there are many languages, including many Indian languages, that have a very productive process of morphological causativization. To see this, let us see the data from Hindi. Sentences 11, 12 and 13 are on your screen. Ram fell, Ram gira. Deena made Ram fall, Deena ने राम को गिराया. Mona had Deena make Ram fall, Mona ने Deena से राम को गिरवाया. Let us first see what's happening in the sentences 11 and 12. Object of the transitive verb in 12 is the same as subject of the intransitive verb in 11. But where English uses a causative verb make, Hindi uses a verbal affix a. This a is the causative morpheme in Hindi. Now let us look at the pair of sentences 12 and 13. Where English uses two causative verbs in 13, Hindi adds another morpheme a to the transitive verb. Thus, Hindi puts the subject of the transitive verb into a safe phase in the ditransitive, whereas English treats Deena and Mona both as subjects of different clauses. Therefore, English appears to have two clauses in 13, whereas Hindi appears to have only one clause. This is crucial for the discussion in hand. So the questions that we deal with in morphosyntax relate to Why do languages show these similarities and differences? How should these regularities be expressed? And to what extent can languages vary in expressing causativization? Let us now talk about morphosyntax and the rules that appear to change grammatical functions. Idea of universal grammar states that Indian grammar can both express the idea of causativization slightly differently, and either way of expressing it should be easily learnt by any child placed in that language environment. Whether the causative morpheme is a word or an affix, that is not important. What is important is that we don't want language particular rules of causativization. What we are attempting at rather is to find theoretical principles that explain the variety in the surface manifestations of causatives. Mark Baker, 1985, he was the one who gave the first clear work on causativization, and this work is based in the government and binding framework of generative grammar. Traditionally, causative has been described as a rule that adds a subject and demotes the existing subject into an object. And a passive has been described traditionally as a rule that takes an object and makes it a subject. Thus, causativization and passives traditionally are seen as grammatical function changing rules. Baker subtitled his book as A Theory of Grammatical Function Changing. Post Chomsky's aspects theory, grammatical functions like subject or object, they were not given any independent theoretical claim. All these were then defined in terms of their position in the syntactic tree. Where a noun phrase occurs, that is what tells us whether it's a subject or an object. A subject was then described as a noun phrase that is immediately dominated by the sentence node S. The sentence node S was in the later theories referred to as IP, inflectional phrase, or TP, tense phrase. Object was then described as that noun phrase that is immediately dominated by a verb phrase VP. Constructions such as the passives now were not described in terms of grammatical relations, but rather in terms of the position of the NPs in the tree. Chomsky notes that the subject of a passive need not be an underlying object. It could also be either part of an idiom or an embedded subject. An example of each is on your screen. When we have the sentence, advantage was taken of Bill, in this the subject is part of take advantage of, from which advantage has moved out. The second sentence, Bill was believed to be the murderer. In this, Bill has started off from the embedded subject position, which can be seen by the gap in the structure. Generative grammar as a theory has to explain why certain rules appear to change grammatical functions. In the government and binding theory framework, certain noun phrases move because they need case, and they move from position in which they receive the theta role or thematic position to the position where they get case. Let us move on to our next topic, that is UTA or the uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis. Idea of shared selectional restrictions, which was applicable in passive, that being the logical object of the transitive verb appears as the grammatical subject in the passive. The minimal pair we saw before, sincerity frightens John versus John is frightened by sincerity. Now if you look carefully, it's important to see that in sentence 2, John is still the object of frighten. He is not the one who is the frightener, the cause of frightening, but he is the frightenee, the recipient of the frightening thing. Although John appears in the subject position in sentence 2, it is still base generated in the object position for that sentence. To break this down further, we see that the verb frighten has two arguments, an agent and a patient. Active verb takes subject and object respectively for an agent and a patient. Passive verb loses this agent argument. The patient appears in the subject position, but it is still interpreted as the object of the verb there. Now the claim that we are trying to make here is that the argument is still an object at some level of representation, and we say that level is the D structure. It moves into the subject position of the verb from that object position after that level of representation. A verb's argument, each has a thematic function or a theta role associated with it, has to first be mapped into some way into a grammatical position in the syntactic tree. To that position, we correspond the labels subject, object, and so on. Selectional restrictions and semantic interpretations require a constant thematic to syntactic mapping. Thematic role hierarchy across world's languages goes like agent, patient, goal, recipient, and so on. By this we mean that majority cases, agents or subjects are overwhelmingly agents in world's languages. Patients are usually objects in the world's languages. When the patient is a subject, like in the case of a passive, there is a marking on the verb that marks it in some special way. Languages map theta roles into syntactic positions in some principled way, and later in the syntax, arguments move around for other reasons. Example, to get case. These displaced arguments still fulfill the selectional restrictions of the predicate in their original position, and they are still semantically interpreted in that position. Following all this, Baker formulated this idea as a principle, the uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis, which is stated as identical thematic relationships between items are represented by identical structural relationships between these items at the level of D structure. Now that we have established what the principle of Uta states and we have seen morphological causatives in action, how does Uta now explain our morphological causatives? Let us go back to the data we had before for transitive-intransitive alternation in Hindi. Repeated here are sentences 3 and 4 on your screen. Ram gira, Ram fell. Dina ne Ram ko giraya. Dina made Ram fall. For the transitive sentence in 4, English has two subjects of the two verbs, make and fall, whereas Hindi has only one verb, make fall, whose subject is Dina and whose object is Ram. Whether the causative morpheme is a free morpheme, a word, or a bound morpheme and affix, the sentence surfaces as biclausal or monoclausal. If the sentence is biclausal, Ram surfaces as the subject of fall. In the Hindi monoclausal causative, Ram surfaces as the object of the verb make fall. Now this is a problem for the hypothesis of Uta developed before. The solution that was given for this is that the causative sentence in 4 in Hindi actually starts off with two verbs exactly like in English. Evidence and support for this came from Baker's work on the language Chichewa, and this is an African language which has morphological causatives. If you see the data in 5a and 5b on your screen, we have the Chichewa sentence for the girl made the water pot fall. Now this sentence can be stated in two ways. If you see the literal translation given for 5a, the girl did cause that water pot fell, and the literal translation for 5b, the girl fall caused the water pot. Observe the morphemes marked in bold on your screen, its and the gwa, and their position in the sentence. Now we can see that there are two clauses in 5a, whereas there is one clause in 5b. Water pot is the subject of the second clause in 5a, object of the single clause in 5b. In Chichewa, the causative morpheme is the its, and the verb for fall is the morpheme gwa. In 5b, this verb for fall, gwa, moves out of the embedded clause to the matrix clause, and the causative affix attaches to this verb in the matrix clause. In 5a, the causative affix attaches to a verb do, which could be a dummy support verb, like in other cases. Baker therefore suggested that the verb fall incorporates into the causative affix its. If we were to give a structure of these two sentences, then that structure would look like what is on your screen. The sentence A has the verb fall as a VP daughter of S, and we have another V which has the causative morpheme its as the daughter of the VP, higher VP. If you look at structure B, there you have movement of this fall verb morpheme which leaves its trace behind, and it moves to the causative affix in the higher verbal head where it gets incorporated to give us this complex GUI its. The structure starts out as 6A, embedded verb moves and incorporates into the causative affix. This has subsequent effects on case assignment which we won't be dealing with right now. To summarize what we have been looking at in this module, there are selectional restrictions between a verb and its arguments which can be motivated by a single structure in the aspect style theory. The two constructions that surface as active and passive in the world's languages have this selectional regularity intertwining them. Rules of derivational morphology may also output constructions that are related to their input by such selectional regularities. The rules of derivational morphology now they lead to a new component in the grammar which had little explanatory power. A second problem that arose was that some morphology had perforce to happen after the syntax. Example, case could be assigned to NPs only after they had moved. These NPs would then trigger agreement, and so on. Now this led to an untidy picture where some morphology was syntactic and some was lexical. It would be better if all morphology was part of syntax. This was what led to the birth of morphosyntax. Derivational morphology includes well-known Valency changing operations such as causativization. The concept of thematic to syntactic mapping, that's mapping from a verb's argument structure which specifies the thematic functions or theta roles that its arguments have, to the syntactic structure where these arguments appear in the positions of subjects, objects were also looked on. This thematic to syntactic mapping expresses regularities across languages, and lexically related words was formulated by Baker as UTA, or the uniformity of theta assignment hypothesis. We also noticed similarities as well as differences in the way world's languages express causativization, and this process of causativization in a language called Chichewa gave us important insights into how English type as well as Hindi type causatives could in fact have derived from one. We saw that Baker proposed a rule of incorporation, specifically verb incorporation, that related the two structures of causatives. Thank you.